Hey everyone, it's Preston Clark. You are here for Unbundling CLM, the rise of contract management point solutions. I'm joined by my friend Zach Abramowitz and Daniel Lewis. We're going to have a great discussion today for you. We're expecting about 200 people on the webinar, so I'm going to wait just a couple of minutes here as folks pile in. As you are coming in, feel free to let us know where in the world you're joining us from. I'm also going to launch a poll here in just a second that tells us a little bit about where you might be on your CLM journey. This is helpful for us as the fireside chatters today, because it gives us a sense of where you are coming from. We had about 75 questions pre-submitted as a part of the webinar registration process. Thank you for doing that. And we learned a lot about what you are looking for. I think a lot of you are looking for the answer to the question of, if I'm not going to do CLM, what ought I do? And I promise that Zach and Daniel and myself will dive into that. But if you could take a minute just to respond to this poll, it'd be very helpful. And we'll show the results back to you as well, so you can see where the rest of the group stands on this. We'll leave this open for just another 10 seconds here. There's 105 folks on so far, so thank you all for joining us. I know this is who does a webinar in July, right? Everyone is heading off to vacation and elsewhere, but appreciate you giving us some time today for a topic that I think is a pretty interesting one. Okay, let's take a look at the results. Zach, Daniel, here we go. 16% already implemented. 8% trying to implement, but not so happy. 36% currently evaluating. That's wonderful. And then 37% just curious about the topic. So we can appreciate that. It's a very interesting topic. And then 3% or other. So interesting, sort of across the board, different perspectives, but we're going to dive into this topic now. Here is the agenda. We're going to talk about the promise of CLM. Zach's going to give some really good perspective and insight here in terms of the backstory of how we got here. We all have read the hype cycles. We've all seen the press releases and the huge funding rounds. So we're going to talk about how we got here, why all of us are so familiar with CLM as a concept, while many of us are also wary of what it means to implement and purchase CLM. We're going to talk about the shortcomings of CLM in very specific terms, about what it doesn't do and why it is problematic. And then we'll talk about the future of contract management and where to go from here. Many of you submitted questions ahead of time, specifically saying, okay, what else? What should we do instead? And we're going to talk about that with a degree of specificity today. We're not going to tell you what to buy. We're not going to analyze your circumstance live on the webinar, unfortunately, and tell you as a result you should do X, Y, and Z. But we will give you some framework and some ideas on how to approach unbundling CLM within your organization. My name is Preston Clark. I am the president and co-founder of Law Insider, the host of today's webinar. I also own a company called Simple Docs, which, not unintentionally, is an unbundled approach to contract lifecycle management. I was an assistant general counsel earlier in my career, but have spent most of my 15 plus years building and scaling software companies. Zach Abramowitz, we got to meet in person for the first time at Legal Innovators California just a few weeks ago in San Francisco. We had a wonderful conversation and discovered that we had lots of alignment on this specific topic. And so as soon as I got back from the trip, I reached out and said, we ought to do a webinar on this. Zach, can you take a minute to introduce yourself specifically through the lens of this topic and sort of what you bring to this conversation today?
Sure. And I think that particular conversation in San Francisco was maybe the longest conversation I've ever had upon meeting someone. Like, it was instantaneous. We just kind of got into this conversation. Yeah, a lot of aligned interests. So a little bit about me, my background. I'm a former practicing attorney, left law to start, to start businesses and invest in businesses, and I do both those. I'm the founder and CEO of Killer Whale Strategies, which is a consultancy that works with legal teams of all shapes and sizes that want to capitalize and really lean in to the disruption that's been sweeping over the legal industry. So our typical customers include AmLaw 1 and 200 law firms, Fortune 500 legal departments, legal service providers. We're very often, and this is relevant to this particular conversation, consultants to the consultants. So I've advised Big Four and other service providers, as well as legal staffing agencies. We currently work with the AAA, that they've been very vocal and spoken about that, so I don't mind naming them. So we work with all of these companies, but my particular interest in contracts, I think, really has to do with, number one, that it was the kind of biggest topic over the last 5 years by any stretch, especially when you were speaking with legal departments. So many of my corporate legal clients were specifically, looking at contracts and wanted us to evaluate the space and recommend strategies. I'm also an investor in TermScout, which is a contract tech company that there's not necessarily a CLM, but I think will fall into this sort of definition that we'll talk about in a bit. It's contract tech. So I've seen, what it looks like also for smaller startups to be selling contract technology into bigger organizations. So I have a view from sort of all sides. By the way, I'm really pumped also to be on with Daniel, because I feel like Daniel brings, from someone who's been selling technology to lawyers from before they even knew they wanted it. So I'm glad that, I think Daniel brings a perspective on the conversation that I don't. So I'm excited to be on the panel with both of you.
And with that, Daniel, same introduction to you. Would love to learn a little bit about your background and how it relates to this topic.
Yeah, so my name's Daniel Lewis. I lead Legalon Technologies here in the United States. And Legalon is a AI contract review company. We help in-house teams review contracts before signing them. I've been in the legal technology space now for over 12 years. Prior to this, I was leading businesses at LexisNexis, including Practical Guidance, where we had a team of over 300 attorneys writing content and giving practical advice across a range of different practice areas, serving in-house teams, serving law firms, serving small firms. And I ended up at Lexis after they acquired my first company, which was Ravel Law, a company I founded and led, which was a legal research and analytics company. We primarily sold into large law firms to support them with advanced litigation needs. So I'm actually a little bit new to CLM. I've been pulled into it by speaking with in-house teams over the last several years. At Lexis in particular, I spent a lot of time talking with in-house teams and hearing about their pain points. And so as I got sort of more invested into that, I learned more and more about CLM. Simply because it was sort of the general water that in-house teams seemed to be swimming in. It was like the one new technology that everybody was getting exposed to. But now having my hands dirty for several years, I can enrich that perspective with a lot more in the weedsness now, a lot more direct conversations and lessons learned, and perspective on having seen the space evolve for the last 10 years or so.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you, Zach. I like starting with introductions in something like this, where you understand where the backgrounds are of the presenters or of the chatter, the fireside chatters in this case, in particular, or maybe specifically, so that you know that there's relevant expertise, but also so that you understand where our biases might be coming from. And so listen, Daniel and I do in fact own software companies that are point solutions that in some ways proactively unbundle CLM. And so you should know that and understand that's a vantage point we take. Listen, CLM is very popular for lots of good reasons and maybe some bad ones, as Zach will talk to us about in a couple of minutes. But Zach also is in the business of helping organizations think through how they might bring technology into their organizations. And so his bias is finding effective ways to do that. And so I think he has some really good perspective. You may not even call it bias. It may be ideology that relates to practical, pragmatic approaches to solving legal and business solutions that don't require as much robust commitment as CLMs often require. So let's jump into it now. I wanted to start here. Zach, this is a slide that you created, so I'd love for you to speak to it. I want to use this as a framing exercise because when we say, think twice about CLM, or maybe CLM isn't what you think it is, we need to frame it against what the alternative is at the macro level so that we have a shared understanding for the next 45 minutes that we're together here today of when we say not CLM, what else is there? We'll get into the specifics, but generally speaking, Zach, can you frame the difference between CLM and contract tech?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this visual is and these definitions are ones that I came up with together with Brian Bratcher, who's the managing director at Gravity Stack. They're the technology subsidiary of Reed Smith. And we wrote an article about it. You can see on legalevolution.org a few years back. And we thought this was a really important definition at the time, not because you had asked me to participate with you in a conversation about unbundling CLM. So, this is one of those places where we're sort of like really both sort of seeing the same thing from different places. But because we felt that at the time, everyone was calling themselves a CLM company. And it made sense why. The CLM as a vertical was growing in popularity, and it was even showing up on wish lists of chief information officers, sometimes heads of procurement, or even sometimes the GC or CLO as a kind of, hey, we're supposed to have one of these. And in fact, there were many times that I would have clients, very large legal departments, that would say, we feel like we're supposed to have a CLM now. Like that's the next step. And I said, why? I said, like, what's it? What are you hoping it accomplishes for you? And very candidly, they would admit to me, well, we're not really sure, but we just kind of think we're supposed to have one. Right. And so this term CLM was getting thrown around without much like purpose or reason behind it in terms of like what it was actually going to accomplish. And second of all, there were companies that we saw that were calling themselves CLM that seemed not to necessarily, like there were a lot of companies that would do stuff with your contracts at a very kind of like broad level, but they were all using this term CLM. It seemed to have lost all meaning. So the definitions that we used here, and I very much like to kind of get on the same page that like, hey, are we all talking about the same thing here? Was contract lifecycle management, or CLM, is essentially a workflow that exists inside every single company. It starts at the moment that there's a request from the business to create a contract, or maybe someone is in the business has created a contract already and they didn't even realize it because they agreed to something. But there's a contract request that comes in, and that workflow is going to continue all the way until when that contract is renewed, or until when it's disposed of. Right. So this is the contract life cycle. And by the way, contract life cycle is essentially a smaller process within a larger process in any business, right? So whether it's procurement, something the company is buying, or sales, something the company is selling, the contract is just one part of that much bigger life cycle. And when I say a workflow, I mean there's several stages of getting that contract signed, stored, and then ultimately renewed. And there's different people along the way that need to look at that contract for any variety of reasons. And that's why we refer to it as a workflow. At its core, though, that's what the tools, the CLM tools, purport to do, is get you from stage one all the way to, I think we've got 9 stages here, right? All the way to stage 9, and then ultimately back to stage 1. And the workflow is supposed to accomplish that. And how is this workflow typically, traditionally accomplished inside businesses? Well, either through a phone call or an email. Someone walks a contract down the hall, and Charles gives it to Sue, and then Sue looks at it. And so this workflow has existed for years. What the CLM tools were trying to do was streamline that entire process, was create one single workflow that we could be sure is going to keep this contract moving throughout the organization, moving for the various phases so that we can get to an agreement and we can get to renewals, right? And that's, so it's a workflow. It's a workflow tool. And in the same way that, like a Basecamp or a Monday or any of these other organizational workflow tools work, this one is made specifically for contracts. And I think that was where you started to see a lot of the money going over the last few years. Separately, we had this other definition, which was contract tech. And this are what you, Preston, referred to as like a point solution, meaning it accomplishes something very specific in the document, perhaps the negotiation phase, or it knows how to get from being signed to stored, or it's the process. There's companies that are doing this right now of like finding contracts wherever they might exist in your organization to get them back into a repository. So the idea is like along every one of these stations, there's specific tasks that need to be accomplished. We're going to acquire them. These solutions form those tasks. Now, where this has become fairly confusing, and this is why this definition is important, is of course, over the last few years, the way any market works is everyone wanted to be everything. The contract tech companies wanted to call themselves a CLM and say that they were building a workflow because they saw all the venture capital money was pouring into workflow tools. At the same time, a lot of the workflow tools wanted to have contract tech functionality because they didn't want you getting stuck at any one of the stations. They wanted to automate. They wanted to get you through the various stations. Plus, I think there was a sort of tacit acknowledgement that the workflow wasn't all that useful without a lot of the contract tech, that in fact the contract tech, right, these automated processes were very valuable, but not necessarily in the way that a venture capital firm would invest 100 million with you valued at $1 billion. They were looking for the kind of like, well, we want something that can be end to end. I think, by the way, you saw this, a great example is Onnit. Onnit was kind of like your standard workflow tool. They weren't originally even built with contracts in mind, but they built a CLM product that was essentially taking workflows from other legal department workflows, applying them to contracts. And then they went and acquired various companies that performed specific of those contract functions, what I call contract tech. So I think you saw a lot of this. I think you still see it to a certain extent. But that's as far as the definition. I hope I didn't talk everyone's ear off.
No, that's great, Zach. And I want to jump to the promise. And I think you touched on the promise of CLM a bit already. I want to jump to that specifically. I will say maybe one comment back to you, or one, I'm not sure if this is a question or just sort of perspective that I'd love to get your take on, is that as you were describing CLM, it occurs to me that it feels and sounds very much like an integrated system that almost necessitates a series of connected tools and parts that would seem the end result or the best solution would be a CLM, or maybe the opposite argument, contract tech, where you have point solutions that are standing on their own islands. How could they enable a system if they are just one cog in something that is much larger? And that's a larger point that we can dive into, but I see that as sort of, it's not by accident that CLM became popular. There was a logic to its reasoning, whether it delivered on it or not. There's a logic behind it.
100%. Meaning, like if you came from like the world of Salesforce, right, on the sales side, right, or if a CRM, or if you came from procurement tools, you looked at what they were accomplishing and you said, okay, well, why can't we just apply that same sort of discipline to the contract process? And it absolutely makes a lot of sense. And in terms of like the strategy of bundling them, certainly makes a lot of sense, because you want to have a product that really could be, as much as possible end to end. And like you said, without the contract tech along the way, the trains don't necessarily move as well through these various stations.
Yep. Okay. Well, let's dive into it. For those just joining, we're about at 200. A lot of you have just joined in the last few minutes, so apologies that you missed the introduction. We have 3 chapters today. We're going to start with the promise of CLM. We're going to then talk about sort of the failings of CLM. And then, of course, we'll end with what you're likely here for, which is, okay, well, now what? If we don't implement CLM, what ought we do? So let's talk about what CLM was supposed to deliver. Again, Zach, let's start with you here. You touched on this a bit already in the previous slide,
Yeah.
but would love to go a bit deeper, because I think this is the genesis, or this is the foundation of what will be the endpoint, because we're going to recommend a different approach. Unbundling CLM is the punchline. But before we get there, let's talk about how we got here to the first place with CLM.
Sure, and I'll make sure to leave some space here for Daniel, because I know he's got a perspective to share on this as well. But I would say that the promise and what CLM was supposed to deliver was removing frictions and improving a process that had plenty of pain points in it. Meaning, contracts are not just a massive pain point for companies in terms of the amount of work that goes into them, but they're incredibly valuable assets to the organization, right? If you think about a due diligence, you think about when one company buys the other, right? What do we put into the deal, into the deal room? We put the company's contracts, right? These are essentially like the kind of like atoms of a successful business. Is your contracts. Furthermore, if you have a kind of more idealistic, version of contracts, you think of these as like the beginnings of relationships or adding relationships. And these are very, very important documents for a business. They're essentially what allows a business to grow, right? Your ability to, again, for some organizations, the first reminds me of the first M&A deal I ever worked on. Company had 2 contracts. Very, very valuable, energy company, but they were essentially functioning on what amounted to 2 contracts. It's not the case for most businesses, and but we understand that buried in our contracts are a lot of important data points for the business. Data points in the sense of like things that just need to get done. Like, wait, when is this contract getting renewed? Or does like one of our contracts have this clause in it? And we need to look through our contracts and find like all the contracts where we may have some risk exposure because of some new regulation out of the EU, right? So there's like lots of things that need to be done with contracts, and they have important data there that we need to mine, we need to be able to get to. But there's also, I think, a sense of like, there's a lot of insights in contracts, meaning if I could get a better hold on what's inside my contracts, what might I discover about my business? And so I think that the promise of contract technology and CLM was to create order around something that needed more order, either because it needed to be faster in certain cases. Sometimes organizations didn't necessarily want to move faster. They wanted to be more compliant. So a CLM could be designed to accommodate that as well. So like there were the sort of disorganized process that needed more order to it. There was a lot of unstructured data that was really important for an organization that needed more structure. And I think that really, when you boil it down, that was the promise of what CLM was supposed to deliver for in-house teams, is like, okay, you're going to make our lives a heck of a lot easier because we are currently chasing our tails on contracts, and you're going to help me like really get in touch with what's inside my contracts and have contracts that feel like, and I'm just kind of starting with why here, and that are living and breathing, right? Contracts that aren't just sort of like sheets of paper, but contracts that are dictating, okay, now as a company, we must do this. Now as a company, we must do this. So I think that was the promise of CLM.
Yeah, and a good promise, right? We've all seen scenarios where lots of VC dollars have flooded into a new emerging category, only for it to completely evaporate. And we're not in a scenario, at least in my opinion, where we're in an evaporation. These are real problems that need solutions, that are searching for them. The point that I think that we are collectively making today, or trying to make, is that maybe CLM is too heavy, too bulky. It's going too far, and as a result, the promise is not achievable, at least in most cases. Daniel, to you, anything you want to add? I know you have some other perspectives as we get deeper into this topic today, but anything you want to add in terms of the setup of the promise of CLM?
Yeah, I think when I speak with in-house teams, people are consistently dealing with similar problems. And so if you look across CLM websites, they're all trying to speak to those problems with a promise, right? In-house teams, they want to move faster on their deals. They want to speed up deal cycles. They want to reduce tedious work. They want to organize kind of chaos from their contracts that might be scattered in different places and they don't know what's in them. Like those are common problems, right? Around organizing your data, being able to handle it for compliance or simply search across it, reducing tedious work, moving faster. And so if you look at CLM websites, that's the promise I find they're consistently trying to message as well. Say, hey, we will speed up your deals. We will help reduce tedious work. We will bring order to chaos, just as Zach has touched on. And then maybe most ambitiously, they'll say, hey, we'll unlock value from your contracts that's going to win you a lot of money that you were overlooking. You're going to find, dollars under your couch cushions kind of thing.
Yeah, a fun experiment or fun project. If anyone is bored, you literally can go to every single CLM website, and their taxonomy, the nav bar, is exactly the same. How do I know this? Because I have done it, and I have deconstructed every major CLM's website for reasons I'll spare you. And they all have product, solution, and each of those product and solution are structured the same way. So they're all delivering the same product. They're all delivering it to the same audiences. And it's just fascinating and speaks to what Daniel just commented on, that everyone has sort of created the same sauce and the same recipe. And I think it's, largely driven by more so than by venture capital than actual market need. Okay, shortcomings of CLM. I promise we will get past the shortcomings. So the back half of the webinar, we're going to talk about where we go from here. Many of you submitted questions already that will flash up on the screen and get into. If you want to start asking questions, if you didn't get to submit questions ahead of the webinar, we encourage you to put those in the chat now, and we will start reviewing those as we get into this back half, the last 30 minutes of this session today. The shortcomings of CLM, again, this is not doom and gloom. We're going to get into the promise or the new promise of where we might go in terms of unbundling CLM. But let's take one more minute now to talk about downside of CLM and sort of what happened here and where we've seen so many failures as a result of how CLM has been packaged to us. And Zach, if you want to walk us through this slide.
Yeah, and so, and keep in mind, what's interesting about this slide is this slide is actually a few years old already, and I don't like to flex too much on old predictions. But what I do like to do is if I feel like I made an effective prediction about something where I showed my work, then I kind of want to keep going down that path. So I have a certain bias. You talked about biases before, Preston. I have a certain bias towards the prediction, but I have been highlighting for years many of the complaints about CLMs. And a few years ago at the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium in Las Vegas, someone got up on stage and said, "Stand up if you have a CLM." And half the room stood up. They said, "Okay, now stay standing if it's still working." And almost every seat got reoccupied. And I think that this spoke to something which is, with all the promise of what CLM was supposed to accomplish, when you actually looked into the organizations, very often there wasn't even full implementation. The implementation cycles were torturous. At this point, I think it's public. There's been lawsuits against iCertis for implementations that took too long, and the Change Healthcare, which sued iCertis, basically said, "Hey, listen, we spent like millions of dollars, forget on like the software fees, which were $2 million plus a year with iCertis. We've had to spend millions of dollars, not to mention our own in-house resources that are trying to get this CLM up and working, and it still doesn't work." So there, like when you actually went into organizations, you would find very, very long implementation cycles that very often would sort of, like either end in a kind of stalemate or just kind of keep on going ad infinitum until the people that were, running point on that implementation either moved on to another department in the business or moved to another job. I mean, these cycles were really, really long. So I think that was the first issue. I think the second issue is that just didn't make anyone's life better. You would very often I would hear a lot of stories of people who would say, hey, listen, I'm now spending so much time on the CLM implementation that we've had to hire temps to do my work. Right. So the drain on the company with the CLM products was really well documented. Now, why that happened, I think that there's any number of factors. I'll highlight a few. I think first of all, the people who made a lot of money from CLM were the CLM consultants. There were big four that were doing it. Elevate, United, Lex, a lot of the different ALSPs out there loved these deals because they were long. There was a lot of work. You might come away with, $1.5 million on the implementation itself. So there were incentives for the consultants to recommend these products. And so that's the first. So there was a misaligned incentive structure in terms of like finding you the right product. If I'm an outside consultant and I found a really lean CLM product that I thought could really help the organization, but it was only going to cost them, it was going to cost them for the full implementation might be like a kind of like a 2-week configuration. That's for me as a consultant's
worst nightmare.
It's my worst nightmare, right? So like, again, this is part of the reason as a consultant, I do not do implementations because I feel it's a huge conflict of interest in terms of like, I can recommend you what I think you should do. And I can tell you people who do implementations, but I think having those come from the same party, huge misaligned incentive. Furthermore, there was I think a constant feeling from all of these companies that they had to be everything to everyone. So they had to integrate with every other one of your systems. They had to address not just one specific kind of contract, but every contract. So I think misaligned incentives, the fact that they tried very often to do more than what was their actual expertise, while being forced to grow very quickly because they're all funded by venture capital companies who want to see their return in 10 years. And I think that was challenging. And then forgetting maybe the most difficult part of it is that you're trying to implement in the legal department, which is not necessarily the most important, like the top of the totem pole when it comes to getting tech budgets and when it comes to adopting technology. At its core, though, I think the reason that sort of the downside of CLM has been people have very specific contract-based pain points in their organization. And very often they would want to solve those. And they had a sort of core level understanding that, we can do better contracting here. The problem is the CLM became the hammer to hit all nails, right? And in fact, I think many of the solutions didn't require a hammer, right? They weren't a nail. They simply, like, if I could recommend 15 different ways that a company could improve contracting and could improve their contract process before recommending a CLM. And so I think that the fact that the CLM kind of became this like catch-all solution to any organization that wanted to have better contracting, that's where the expectations were totally misaligned, because very often the CLM wasn't even going to address the sort of core contracting issues that an organization had.
Zach, can we agree to publish an article together entitled 15 Ways to Improve Your Contract Process Without Implementing CLM and send it to this audience after the webinar?
I was saying we could publish it on BuzzFeed, 15 contracting processes you never thought you needed.
I love it. Daniel, I know you have a take on this. I will say, Zach mentioned that this slide had some points that were a couple years old. I'll give you one new one for 2024, also from Gartner. 50% of CLM implementations will fail to deliver the expected value. That is a stat from Gartner for 2024. So the world has not changed much in the last 2 years. Daniel, I know you have a take on this. Would love to hear it.
Yeah, I think anecdotally that data feels right to me as well. We work with a lot of different companies who have a CLM or are thinking about a CLM, and they can use our AI contract review software in addition to that. But I've been really surprised by how many organizations tell us we just ripped out our old CLM and we're implementing a new one. And this is the second time we've done that in 5 years. Because I feel like the promise of these systems is that you implement them and they work for a decade plus. Like they should stick around. They should be a source of truth and knowledge. And the fact that they're not doing that, that people are ripping and replacing either because they've failed or because the products just aren't that sticky, is sort of this like very yellow red flag to me that they're not living up to the promise. And I think what Zach touched on is what I hear as well, which is folks are implementing, they have specific pain points. It could be around intake. It could be around generating documents from templates. It could be around reviewing contracts. It could be around searching contracts that they've already executed. And they have this specific pain, but they're buying a general purpose tool. And then that general purpose tool, maybe they're only implementing a small piece of it. Like they're buying a CLM, but only using it for the search repository functionality. And it's in that disconnect between the pain and the cost of doing an implementation to then solve a specific pain point where I think a lot of pain, like new pain, gets created within organizations because they're doing all of this effort and only reaping some of the gain. And now, prices are starting to creep up too as CLMs try to ratchet up prices year over year and say, hey, we've got all these new features, but the customer's only using this one small piece of it as well. So yeah, I think that piece to me has really stood out as we speak with lots of in-house teams, like a general purpose tool bought to solve only like a point solution problem.
Right. And that's why, yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to sort of add on to that or magnify that point, which is that this is the better contracting point. There's sometimes like hey, listen, if we want to improve contracting in the organization, that doesn't mean we need to do like a full tear down renovation. Like we can just remodel our kitchen and like the house will be a little bit better and that's manageable.
Yeah. Well, and just understanding that you have that as an option, that you can unbundle this and do the kitchen remodel by itself and crawl your way there or stack your way there rather than saying, hey, let's move out of the house for a year and a half and spend $1 million and then come back and then maybe it'll be the way we like it. Okay, let's I want to take 5 more minutes to run through. I'm going to share just a few slides on my specific perspective on the failings of CLM. And then I promise we're going to get into your questions and we're going to talk about where to go from here if you should choose to unbundle CLM. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes now. It just takes too long to reach expected value in CLM. If any of you are familiar with enterprise software, Workday or Salesforce or things of that nature, you have an appreciation for how hard implementations can be, how much they are a system design. And yet they don't get the bad rap that CLM does. We're not on stage giving a presentation about unbundling Salesforce. This is distinct and it's unique. And I want to talk just for 2 minutes here about why I think it is unique. So here's the pop quiz. How do other enterprise software categories overcome time to value challenges? So when I say time to value, I mean that when we implement CLM or any software, oftentimes our measure or our sort of happiness score is based on the relationship between how much value we've derived and how long and how much pain it took to get to that point. And in the case of more established software, enterprise software categories, it's actually much faster to get to foundational material value than it turns out it is in the case of CLM. And so I want to talk about that for a minute. The pop quiz is how do you get fast time to value in these more established? Each one of these, by the way, has a bigger market cap than CLM. So these are more established, bigger. So learning management system, CRM, Salesforce, HRS, Workday, marketing automation, it's like Marketo. Each of these is bigger. From they're multi-billion dollars. I think contract lifecycle management is in the $3 or $4 billion. Each of these is bigger than that. Here is the answer. I'm going to take just a minute on this. In the case of CRM, you can immediately upload your customer records and have a customer record tracking system that is superior to whatever spreadsheet or whatever sort of archive system you have now. So you immediately, day one, have the ability to have visibility into your customer relationships. It gets better over time. There's lots of integrations with Salesforce. There's a million things you can do, but day one, you can have customer record tracking, or maybe not day one, but day 90, day 30, day 60. Learning management system, Cornerstone is the largest publicly traded. They give you compliance training. So you may have ambitions of all sorts of other training initiatives within your organization, but you have your AB 1825 in California, you have your SB 1343, you have your chief compliance officer trainings mandated, whatever it may be, code of conduct. Those are running through LMS, and that happens day one. HRS, payroll, of course, Workday there's nothing harder to implement than Workday, becomes the center of your workforce. It might take 2 years to implement, but payroll is running what is more important than payroll, right? The organization would rebel if this didn't work. They're delivering it day one. Marketing automation, they'll get your newsletter, your marketing out. So in every case, major enterprise software categories have a very core foundational value that they're always delivering, and they're delivering it right away. And what I posit to all of you is that CLM doesn't have that. The CLM lacks this core value prop. And you can say, oh, it's repository, except you can get a repository anywhere, right? You don't need to buy a CLM in order to get a repository. And so the reality is that CLM is too big and takes too long. And then the end result is that you've overpaid for something that is not giving you at the core an enterprise value that other sort of categories are known for. So let's just hang here for one more minute. CLM ultimately didn't achieve its promise for the reasons Zach discussed and Daniel discussed, and we have no sort of reason to tell you not to implement CLM, because there's plenty of reasons to do it. If you have the readiness, the budget, the buy-in from your CFO in every corner of your organization, by all means, do it. But I think that for many organizations, and Daniel and I chatted about this earlier today, they approach Daniel, they approach me, they approach Zach, and they say, we need to buy a CLM. And we say, why? And they cannot give us an answer. They say that we have reached a level of commercial contracting maturity or size that warrants the purchase of CLM. But when you start asking the questions from a process and system perspective, they've actually not done any of the work. And so when Zach said consultants love implementations, it's because you buy CLM before you have a plan, before you understand the implications of what it's going to take to implement it at full scale. And now the only way out of it is to try to get out of the contract, good luck, or hire an implementation expert to help you figure out all the pieces to actually extract the full value from the CLM, which in many cases still fails. And so I go back to Zach's analogy of remodeling your kitchen. That's why we're here today, is we want to encourage you all to think about CLM, not in terms of a massive enterprise software platform, but as those 9 bullets or 9 icons that Zach had on the screen earlier, and think about each of those discreetly and how you might approach it. So let's now bridge the part that you were here for, which is, where do we go from here? We're going to take questions from the audience, but let's start here. Macro question, Zach, then Daniel, or let's do it reverse, Daniel, then Zach. For those who are considering CLM, which was, I think, 30% of this audience here today, based on the starting poll, what's your advice? What's your macro advice in terms of approaching contract management, contract tech in a way that isn't too big, too heavy, and too prone for failure?
Yeah, I always laugh when I think about when I was at Clock, the legal operations conference last year, and we had folks come by the booth saying, "Hey, we're wandering around, we're looking for CLMs, we're evaluating CLMs. Is your company a CLM?" We said, "Well, what problem are you trying to solve?" And they said, "Well, we're looking for CLMs." And so my advice centers from that, which is like, what problem are you trying to solve? Like you said, there are these different stages in the workflow. And I think teams that are doing their preparation and thinking strategically about where is the most friction in their process? Where are their teams complaining the most? Where does the most time go? That preparation is useful no matter what, whether you're going to implement a CLM or identify some other solution. But it's through that process where you're going to identify the lowest hanging fruit, the opportunities that are least expensive to implement and most valuable once they're done. So I would work backwards from that, understanding your process, understanding where the time and the pain is currently, and then being pretty targeted about not trying to solve them all at once. Don't solve 10 problems at once. Solve the top one, solve the top two, and work your way down through there. I think that's sort of a more, it's a more conservative, but it's more prone to success as well. So like you're constraining the blast radius in case things go wrong, right? You're not buying $1 million piece of software that involves having to get 3 teams all coordinated and all implementing it at the same time across procurement and finance and sales. You're implementing solutions that can deliver time to value very quickly. Like you said, Preston, you can show the wins and you can build from there versus trying to tear down everything and reconstruct it all at once and solve 10 or 15 problems when really your top pain points are 80% of the problem that you could solve.
Zach,
So,
anything you want to add? We're going to jump into the audience
yeah.
questions, but want to give you a chance here.
I'll mention a couple of things that Daniel didn't, but I basically agree with everything he said. The first thing I would say is, number one, I think this is an opportunity right now to skew on the side of working with newer companies, right? This is not always the recommendation that I would give, but at the moment, I think that what's happened, especially with the advances in AI over the last year and a half since the launch of ChatGPT, is we are going to see legacy verticals like CLM be deconstructed and built with an entirely fresh perspective, yes. which is why I'm excited about what you and Daniel are both doing here. So like that's the first thing, is like, start by working with newer companies. Do not work with companies that were built on old premises that are now very often trying to cram AI into their product. Start fresh. Number 2 is, and this is sort of adding on to something that Daniel said about knowing your process. Also know your goal. A lot of times people say we want to make contracting better, but they don't really define what that means. Sometimes it's faster deal cycles, but as I said before, sometimes it's a process that is, more tightly compliant, right? So you're not always going for the same things. And I think a lot of times people think, well, this is going to make us faster. It's like, well, not necessarily. It depends what your goal is implementing the CLM. And then I would say the last thing is, make sure that the CLM provider or whatever in CLM, whatever partner that you're working with to make this better, make sure that they can show you case studies. First of all, if you've got companies that are like yours in the same sort of industry, that's very useful. But also make sure that they've got case studies that highlight the KPIs that you want. And last, and I think this is sort of like just an underpinning, is really try to optimize for employee happiness. And you'd be shocked, but most products don't do this. Most products don't say, well, how is my team happier now as a result of the product that I'm using? Because I think that ultimately, if you don't do that, then like the host is going to reject the I forget what the phrase is, but you're not gonna be able to get a team to implement a CLM, especially if you've got like very big plans for everything that you're going to do with contracting in your organization. If the first thing you don't do doesn't just like make people happier.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll jump to the audience questions, but sort of as a segue, the business that I own in this space owns a product called Auto NDA, and we automate non-disclosure agreements. And every single 100% of our customers either had a failed CLM and then took the approach that Zach just discussed, or went through the evaluation cycle of CLM and just became completely overwhelmed by it in terms of how they would get to value. And so I very much appreciate the idea that starting with the problem, starting with the jobs to be done is really important. And one small point that may be big for you at home or at the office right now is that legal doesn't usually buy enterprise software. And we may approve it or we may, be a stakeholder, but we're not the buyers. And when you are the buyer, the stakes are higher. And so it may seem like you're doing more for the organization by purchasing something that is big, but what you really want, as Zach and Daniel have echoed as well, is to get a win, is to deliver something that makes the organization happy. And it's much easier to do that with point solutions that are solving discrete needs for the organization, and then build from there. Okay, let's talk about, these are the ones that came in ahead of time. There were more questions than this, but these were sort of the themes. And so we also have 56 comments in chat, which I'm going to also look through here. We're going to go fast. We got 10 minutes. Let's go. So what new technology or what is the alternative to CLM? That's a big question. There's lots of new technology now. Maybe Daniel or Zach, you want to grab a couple of ideas. Zach mentioned new technology, and I love that, of course, selfishly, but also I think it's in a fast-changing AI-driven world. It makes a lot of sense. But what are some new tools, new emerging tools that we should be looking out for as we're thinking about unbundling CLM?
My fast take on this would be, 5-10 years ago, you literally saw dozens, if not hundreds, of companies all starting to be CLMs. Everybody wanted to be a CLM, lots of competition just in creating general CLM products. Today, you don't really see new companies aiming to be CLMs. Instead, they're starting to solve specific problems. That could be document generation, it could be intake, it could be search, it could be contract review. So that's kind of the new wave. There are lots of companies, too many to name, really, but they're all built around these specific pain points now. That to me kind of indicates the maturation of this contracting tech ecosystem, where we've moved beyond general purpose tools to this new wave of kind of best in class, very targeted point solutions for specific pain points. So that again would be my way of thinking about how do you sift through the options out there, would be to start with what are your most targeted pain points, and then you'll find most likely 5 to 10 or 15 companies that are just trying to solve that specific thing.
Thank you for that. And I'm reading through some of the comments. This is great. I appreciate all of you having conversations with each other and answering your questions. So there's a lot coming in here. I'm going to try to pull some out that weren't already answered by the group, but thank you. Oh, and Lucy, thank you for being on here. Lucy Bosley's here. She's a great CLM expert and brings a lot of perspective. This is such a great group we have on here. Sorry, I've been neglecting the comments. This is wonderful.
To Daniel's point, by the way, that I joked that all you need to do to exhibit at Clock this year was take your conference booth that you had last year that says "We are a CLM company," and you cross out the C and you put in another L, and now we are an LLM company. Like, so it's but I think that's the point's well taken. Like, you don't hear a lot of companies today like saying we're building a CLM. However, I do think there is an opportunity right now, like for what I call deconstructed CLM, which is like start from the ground up, say, hey, like how things going to look different in the AI world. And in that AI world, in that LLM or AI world, how's contracting going to be different? And like, let's kind of build for where the puck is going.
Yeah, that's great. Major consolidation. I'll take this one. I think it's already happening. We saw it with Lexion, and we're seeing interesting partnerships emerge with Evisort and others. So I actually think that CLM consolidation at this stage of the market, which is a relatively new category in enterprise software, is a very bad sign, or at least it's a bad sign that reinforces the points that Zach and Daniel are making. This should be a growth. If CLM were going to be the be all end all, we would not see consolidation. It's also the case that CLM is not a winner take all category, I think, to the massive frustration of the ironclads and others of the world. And so there's a lot of fragmentation, like payroll is an example. HRIS is a similar, it's not winner take all. As big as Workday is, there are literally thousands of payroll vendors in just in the US. And these get rolled up and consolidated all the time. And unfortunately, CLM may have the same fate. Okay, what to do when you're told to make do with Office 365 as there's no budget for anything else? Any tips, tricks, and hacks, guys, for getting to one of those 15 points of value, Zach, without opening up the wallet in a major way?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to review the things that you negotiate about the most. I think that most organizations, when they do this like exercise, they figure out that like the things that we actually argue about don't have any like monetary impact. As an example, can you show me how many NDAs in your organization like have been litigated over the last 2 years? How many did you sign versus how many have been litigated? And the answer is always zero. No one litigates NDAs, right? So like maybe start by NDA is just one example, right? But like start figuring out like what are the things that like we spend a lot of time doing, and before we cement those practices in a workflow, like let's just make sure that they all make sense with like how we're functioning as an organization now.
Yeah, that's
Like
great.
it doesn't require any new technology. It just requires like some self-evaluation, which can be uncomfortable.
Lori, I see your comment, and I +1, as does Erica, looks like. So yeah, let's stop negotiating the NDA. I will say, side note, I've done a tremendous amount of research on NDA process and management over the last 12 months, and it's fascinating because private equity seems to be the one corner of the universe, although others will tell me otherwise, of course, that seems incapable of not negotiating the NDA. Private equity feels compelled. I think it's why Entra exists as a business, that they must negotiate every single NDA that comes across their desk as they evaluate other businesses. But
you
yes.
see, but Preston, I think that just to that point, I think sometimes like when you evaluate your contract processes, what you figure out is like, okay, but the reason we do this is because, X, Y, or Z. So in the case of private equity, maybe they just want to like put up a tough front. They want you to know coming in, we're going to haggle over everything. We're professional investors. This is going to be like a fast moving dance. So like kind of get used to it. And I think that like sometimes it's about tone setting with an NDA. So like and again, that even if it weren't litigated, we might want to have a certain process. But I think sort of kind of getting to those core truths can then help you like with your actual implementation strategy and how and what it is you decide to improve.
Yeah, agreed. Teresa, I see your comment. 100%. It's totally valid. It's not everyone is operating with best practice in terms of the NDAs that they're sending out. And so in many cases, we must negotiate because it's way more than an NDA in reality. Okay, we're going to do We're going to do rapid round here. Do any alternative options to CLM systems involve an AI component? Yes. Daniel's does. Mine does. Most Spellbook, Zach mentioned Otto Hansen's business, screens. It does. So there's tons of point solutions out there, most of which, almost all of which, have AI components. And the notion of hallucinations, I think, are improving. We see lots of hallucinations in the downside when we talk about legal research and case law and other things. It certainly manifests here. Daniel, do you want to take 30 seconds on this? Because I know you've been solving this problem for years, predating OpenAI.
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think hallucinations have bigger and lesser concerns depending on the specific task, right? So legal research is a very difficult task. It requires synthesizing cases and statutes over time and understanding which court is higher than a lower court. And asking technology and LLMs to do that, it might be a bridge too far right now, right? It might be a task that just is beyond what the technology can do. Contract review, in comparison, is a much better area, I think. So the way that we focus on solving this at Legalon is we can ground the LLMs in content written by our own attorneys. So that makes red lines that we can suggest using Gen AI grounded in content and not susceptible to hallucinations in the same way it might be if it's just making stuff up based on the general data it's been trained on. So there are a variety of techniques to try to solve this as a core problem. It's still unsolved. So you need to sort of unpack it a bit and look specifically at the task that Gen AI is being applied to figure out whether hallucinations are going to be a problem and whether the interface lets you inspect the outputs in a way so that you can easily judge whether this thing is true or false, and whether there's a black or white answer that's required.
I know we're at time. There's one more question that was on there that related to money, that related to price. I'm going to give a very broad stroke answer, and if, Daniel, you may have another perspective on this too. We're also, Law Insider is going to publish the Contract Tech Buyer's Guide. Dory Lord, who's running this webinar today, is going to post this poll. If you would like a copy of it, let us know and we will send you one. But pricing generally, and I'm going to make two comments here. If you got to jump, it's all good. What I have seen is $100 to $300 US for point solutions that are unbundling CLM. That is a massive generalization, of course, but a lot of the tools that are maybe redlining tools or workflow automation tools, but that are unbundling CLM tend to be in that range. The sub question within that is, for many of you that are trying to buy CLM, one of the biggest impediments, especially with the big boys like Ironclad, is that the only way to drive the full system level value, which means your business teams, your corp dev team, your sales development team are able to initiate agreements on their own, requires them to have a license, which means that your budget approval to get the CLM in place requires the whole world to come here. And so I would just say that I very much appreciate that the impediment to CLM has cost barriers that I think you won't find with point solutions, because many point solutions, not all, don't price at the seat level, which make them much easier to adopt globally across your business. Okay, if you'd like a copy of the Contract Tech Buyer's Guide, this will go in vendor by vendor into point solutions. So when you look at those 9 icons that Zach showed to you, if you'd like to see specific vendors and their features, so that you can have an overview of, as you're sort of dissecting, as Daniel and Zach mentioned, which problems you want to start with, this will give you some insight. It's not going to recommend one vendor or another or give a score, but it's going to give you an overview of the vendor landscape and a summary of what each one provides, so that you can use it to start thinking about where you might start if you decide not to go full CLM. Okay, that is it. Thank you for an hour and 3 minutes of your time. Zach, Daniel, so appreciative. We will do more of these webinars on CLM. It's a category I care very deeply about: contract management, contract tech. If you are interested, keep an eye out in your inbox from Law Insider. More of these to come. Have a great rest of your day. Hopefully you all get a vacation this summer, if not this week, next or the week after. And we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.